The Raccoon City Police Department was not only the main location of Resident Evil 2, but it also featured in its sequel and in the desperate times scenario of Resident Evil Outbreak File No. 2. It's an iconic location in the series from a gameplay perspective, but it also holds a wealth of lore that can be pieced together from the files in these games, and a few supplemental materials too. Once a place of safety, in the final days of Raccoon City's life, the RPD, like everywhere else, became a nightmare, and the characters that passed through it, Leon, Claire, Jill, are just pieces of the puzzle. This is James for First Aid Spray, and this is the downfall of the RPD. A couple of notes before we get started. Whilst it may feature some of the same characters and events, the 2019 and 2020 versions of Resident Evil 2 and 3 have their own version of the timeline that doesn't quite fit with a lot of the story from the previous games. Thus, we'll be disregarding this version of events in favour of the original RE2, 3 and Outbreak File No. 2. Also, this video wouldn't have been possible without our friends over at the Resident Evil podcast. Special thanks to the Batman for stringing all this information together in a coherent way. And now, on with the video. September 26th. On the morning of the 26th, the owner of Grill 13, the restaurant where Jill and Carlos will later encounter Nemesis, comes to the RPD to take refuge from the outbreak as it grows in severity. Unfortunately, he is killed by police officers who note signs of infection. During autopsy, it's discovered that for whatever reason, he has one of the jewels used in the fixture next to the gates to the City Hall in his pocket. Detective Marvin Branner stores this in a locker in the evidence room. As the day progresses, the RPD is attacked by a horde of zombies. Officer David Ford writes his first entry in Operation Report 1, detailing the great number of injuries and deaths, and the force's plans to gather ammunition that were previously scattered around the precinct under order of Chief Irons 1 day prior. Around this time, with the department in a state of disarray, the Twisted Irons starts walking the halls of the building, killing his officers by shooting them in the back. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the UBCS forces, including Carlos, Nikolai and Mikhail, drop into the city. September 27th. After midnight on the 26th, the police officers make their final stand against the waves of undead coming their way in the epic opening cutscene of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. It's a massacre, and only 20 or so survivors remain afterwards. As they fall back into the precinct, zombies pursue and, at 1 PM on the 27th, break into the west barricade. At this point, survivors become separated. David Ford leads one group with fellow officers Andy and Elliot Edward, and they find themselves held up in the west side of the station. Marvin Branner and Rita Phillips take control of another group in the main hall. Neither team can properly communicate at this time. Ford locks remaining civilians in the evidence room to keep them safe, not knowing that one is infected, and later the whole room will succumb to the T-virus. In a vain attempt to slow the tide of the undead, the remaining officers begin boarding up doorways. Later that night, in a moment of fragility, Ford remarks in the files David's memo that he is contemplating suicide. However, he is interrupted by the first appearance of the liquor picking off his shrinking group of survivors. Meanwhile, a fire breaks out on the helipad. It's at this point that the events of the outbreak scenario Desperate Times takes place. Rita Phillips escapes the RPD via a tiny passage hidden under the statue in the main hall, later returning with an escape vehicle. However, the group of survivors dwindles as fellow officers Aaron, Tony and Fred are killed. Rita escapes with the playable characters, and Marvin, now infected, elects to stay behind and retires to the West office, fatally wounded. September 28th. Sometime in the early hours of the 28th, since he's the only one with access to them, it must be assumed that a wounded Branner barricades more of the doors in the RPD to slow down the potential flow of zombies. Elsewhere, David Ford meets his fate, while Elliot Edward continues his colleague's habit of keeping notes, writing Operation Report 2 at 2:30 AM, remarking that his group now consists of only 4 people, including himself. They agreed to take a chance on attempting to escape through the sewer passages underneath the station. Also on September 28th, Jill Valentine, pursued by Nemesis, attempts to make her escape from Raccoon City and arrives at the RPD that afternoon. Only Marvin, Irons, Elliot and 3 officers are alive, most of which Jill does not encounter in any form in her quick sweep of the station. Elliot and his team are most likely somewhere on the second floor, and Marvin is laying unconscious in the West office. Elsewhere, Ben Bertolucci is hiding in the jail cells under the building, and Irons has retired to his private quarters. Jill grabs the jewel that Marvin previously stored in the evidence room and any other supplies she may need and leaves the station. Sometime after this, the barricades in the department that stopped Jill from exploring further are broken down. As Marvin is unconscious, this must be Elliot Edwards' doing. Seemingly abandoning the idea of escaping through the sewer, Elliot calls for escape via the helipad. At this point, he and Marvin are the only two officers in the station. September 29th. Famously on this day, Leon S. Kennedy drives into Raccoon City and encounters Claire Redfield along the way. They separately arrive at the RPD, one narrowly avoids disaster as a helicopter crashes into the station as Elliot Edward is finally overwhelmed by zombies. The other briefly meets Marvin Branner, who then finally succumbs to his infection hours later. Claire meets Sherry Birkin, who has been asked by her parents to take refuge at the precinct. During this, William Birkin's now mutated form begins to stalk the underneath of the building, looking for a host. He infects Chief Irons and Ben Bertolucci. Both perish violently, and Claire and Leon escape the RPD into the city's sewers, climbing aboard the Galaxia train in Umbrella's underground laboratory. The two leave the city of ruin behind. September 30th and October 1st. Any events that take place during the last 2 days of the RPD are unknown. Perhaps it lays dormant, aside from the shambling of corpses and clicking of liquor claws. Or who knows, maybe more survivors make their way through its halls in the final hours of Raccoon City's waning life. The Raccoon City Police Department, as with the rest of the town, meets its doom in the early hours of October 1st, when the city is sanitized by the US government. And so ends the life of the RPD, and its struggle to simply provide safety for those in need during the final days of the city. Like the rest of Raccoon, it held no chance of standing up against the might of the T-virus infection. Whilst many sought refuge there over the last few days of September 1998, it was the officers themselves who held their posts that perhaps have the most interesting and certainly most overlooked story of all. Let us know what other parts of Resident Evil lore you'd like us to cover in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with everything that we do. This is James for Third State Spray, and Ada, wait!